Welcome, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Space for Life. Real excited about today. This is part of our series on marriage for life. And while this episode and this series is about marriage, I think as you listen through it, you'll see that at the core of this, what we're really talking about is how do we love well? How do we love another person well? Of which our marriages are one of the greatest opportunities and probably the greatest challenges towards loving well. And so wherever you are in the journey of married, not married, divorced, thinking about marriage or whatever, consider this an opportunity to just learn to love better. So today's episode, I think, is going to be great. My good friend, senior pastor at Hope Church here in Richmond, Virginia, David Dwight, is the guest for today. And David, you are my first three-peat guest on Space for Life.
Oh, wow. All right. Love it.
Great honor. So we did an episode back in the very early days of it where we talked about a really fun friendship that we've had getting together over 30 plus years for breakfast at many, many locations. And then we had an episode where you and I talked about kind of a deep dive into Easter. And now we're diving into marriage. So it's great. I'm looking forward to this. Over all of our breakfasts, we've had a lot of conversations about marriage, I have to admit.
Yeah. Well, also, as I've been on the podcast, but listened to a lot of the other podcasts, you've had lots of very meaningful conversation with just a lot of great people who have articulated meaningful content, shared their stories. So it feels like an honor to be able to be on it again. So I'm happy to be here.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. It's really kind of one of the huge fun side benefits of doing this is just the opportunity to have kind of a very clear time to just have a great conversation with people about things that matter deeply. So it's a privilege to kind of be on my end of the podcast.
Yeah.
So we're gonna kind of dive into this subject of marriage. And one of the many reasons I wanted you as third-time guest on all of this is you have a crazy amount of experience with all things related to marriage. I tried to figure it out. You've been pastor for 30, close to 30 years, right?
Well, when I started in ministry was 1990 as an intern and then 91 full time. So we're in the 33-ish years.
Yeah. So I was just kind of figuring 33-ish years, 5 marriages, 10 probably a year that you've done.
Oh, I thought you were suggesting when you said 33 years and 5 marriages, like I've been married 5 times.
that wouldn't be
And I just wanted to head that off in case anybody misunderstood that.
Yeah, that's not the kind of experience I was talking about.
Right. This guy has so much marriage experience.
He's done it 5 times.
5 a year, you said, actually. I think you meant 5 weddings a year, or thereabouts.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, in other words, I've had the privilege of officiating a lot of weddings. Mostly when I think of that, we can use the phrase officiated weddings. I think of it as the privilege of being with a couple to try to help launch their marriage. That's the way that spot feels to me.
Right. So then you combine that with, of course, all of the counseling that goes into helping someone launch their marriage. And then, gosh, who knows, countless, probably hundreds to thousands of sessions with people after the wedding that, probably are very different, harder conversations. And I just think that probably gives you a very unique insight into the challenge, the opportunities, the beauty, sometimes the ugliness that's, in marriage.
Yes, all of that's true. Also, I would want to add a person who's been married for 36 years. and who's done it very imperfectly. And my wife, Elizabeth, her name will undoubtedly come up a number of times in this podcast. We've worked hard at our marriage. And what does that mean? You know, you could have somebody who's in this seat that I'm in with this podcast, and it can sort of sound like, oh, this person's an expert on marriage. I have a lot of experience with it. That's true. An expert, no. A person who's tried to learn and grow through the beautiful, holy invitation that marriage is to us, yes. I've made mistakes. I've got stuff I haven't handled well. I've got parts of my own character that I've seen were lacking that marriage brought to light that made me realize, okay, this is an area I want to try to grow in and improve in and pay attention to. So it's not like experience, which is the result of victory after victory. It's really experience, which is the result of trying to improve and trying to work hard to understand what God has in mind and what he's inviting us into with marriage. And Elizabeth and I have tried to do that together, and we've worked hard at it. You know, we say a lot, all relationships, all committed relationships are going to take work. All committed relationships are going to take work. That is, they're going to ask you to do work. They're going to ask you to do character work, internal work. They're going to ask you to give time and energy. The higher the commitment, the more the work. And when I say that, I'm like nervous that some people think they almost equate the word work with something that's really negative, like, oh no, that's going to be a lot of work. It will ask for a lot of work, but it's work in a good way. It's work in a good sense. It's redemptive work. It's work that God's inviting us into and promising to be in it with us. So that's just me kind of putting some flavor to the marriage experience that we're talking about from the introducing standpoint.
Well, I think it's a great kind of beginning to the conversation because somehow we have to, I think, recognize that the work of marriage and the joy of marriage actually go hand in hand. Those go together. And if you, in essence, try to skip the work, you're kind of diluting the opportunity for the joy and the beauty and the love of it.
I mean, that you and I would probably, I would imagine, agree that that basic principle applies to lots of categories in life.
Yeah.
The joy is connected to the effort, right? And you know, every time, every time after a big game on television, you have the reporter down on the field and they say, how did it feel to win tonight's game? In fact, I just heard this after the Super Bowl. And a couple guys on the Chiefs are like, I can't even begin to tell you how much this means because this team has worked so hard. We put in so much blood and sweat. We've persevered through so much. So I can't even begin to tell you how much this means, right? And they're connecting the meaning to the effort.
Right.
And there's a lot to that. If something doesn't require any real effort of us, I mean, it could be fun and it could be enjoyable, but we don't tend to connect a deep sense of meaning or passion or elation to a really good place because we haven't had all that kind of effort attached to it.
Well, and I would imagine, I think that's one of the challenges that comes around a wedding because in that early days, let's say leading up to uh, a wedding, there are probably a lot of couples that really haven't faced the work of marriage because the relationship to a certain degree has probably come fairly easily,
Mhm.
at that point. And so there's almost an inability to recognize the work that is ahead of them in the
Mhm.
relationship.
Yeah, well, you didn't jump into the deepest end of the pool, but you did sort of skip the 3 feet section there. There's no way you can know what you're in for, like on your wedding day. And in a sense, I think we'll come to this, but a wedding is two people that say that they want to make a marriage vow, a covenantal promise to each other. There are more and more couples these days that choose not to get married. We're just gonna partner. We're just gonna live together. We're not going to get married. And I think that that's largely the result of sort of the secularization of the culture we're living in. But people who, not everybody who gets married is a Christian, but Christians who really are Christians are trying to pay attention to the fact that they're making a covenantal promise to each other. And that's a big part of what we talk about when Elizabeth and I do some marriage teaching and other stuff like that. That's a big part of what we talk about. What is this covenantal promise that we're making to each other? We've just been through 2 successive weekends. The timing of this podcast comes on the heels of 2 successive weekends of teaching a marriage conference that we've developed that we call the Book on Love, the book being the Bible. What does the Bible say about love? And how do we learn what love is? And what is a biblical vision of marriage from the Bible? And over the years that we've taught this, our own experience with some of this matures. And basically, what I would say is there are 2 main ideas in people's minds when we get married. One of them is compatibility, like how compatible are we? And when you get married, you make a covenantal promise. So you have this idea of covenant in mind. Now, some people have weddings and they do have a marriage covenant, but they don't really have any religious engagement with it. There isn't a lot of depth to their understanding of it, which happens. So their sense of the magnitude of the covenant may be slim because they don't have this background as part of their vision of marriage. But basically, let's just say, for example, these are the 2 rails that a marriage is riding on, and they are covenant and compatibility. Most couples, one of the rails is the real driver. It's the thing that they really hold as their vision, whether they know it or not. And this happens as an invisible dynamic, that phrase. Generally speaking, and I know when I speak about generalities, there are always exceptions. So people might say, well, that's not true in my case, and I respect that. But generally speaking, our secular culture makes compatibility the main question about a marriage. Are you compatible? And this brings a lot of sub-layers with it. Like, presumably, if we're really compatible, then you're going to make me happy because we're really compatible. And you fit me well, and you understand me, and you get me, and therefore you're probably going to make me happy. Covenant, if you got married and you didn't make a marriage covenantal promise, you may not have realized, where does covenant come into play? Because the driver, the thing in our vision, was compatibility. So what will happen in every marriage, no matter how compatible you are, once you begin to do life together, domestic life together, pay your bills together, make your decisions together, try to bring 2 lives into one life, you're going to find that there are plenty of places where you're not compatible. And then you're going to have to wrestle with, what do we do where we're not compatible? If compatibility was the thing that this relationship is about, if we find that there's some places where we're not compatible, and the incompatibility begins to present itself in a significant way, if that's the thing the marriage was built on, well, we will have some really hard struggles, and we may get divorced because we don't have the compatibility we thought we needed. But if it's built on covenant, that's a completely different premise.
Yeah, and the other thing that I've seen just in my marriage or marriages in general is that there are seasons of compatibility. There are
Sure.
seasons where that compatibility and that ease with which you're with another person is much greater. And there are seasons where just the very nature of the season or what's happening in one of the individuals within the marriage creates an incompatibility. And we never tend to look at those as seasons because once we're in them, we think they're going to last forever. And so then you have this issue of, oh, well, now we are incompatible.
Right.
So I can tolerate being okay, but incompatible, I didn't sign up for being unhappy. And so then you get to this covenant issue.
Well, and what you're talking about is very nuanced and multi-layered. Generally speaking, the way you're describing it, like we're in a time of real incompatibility, generally that will be an indication of slow drifting from each other.
Mhm.
If we're really trying to stay in touch with each other, we're really communicating well, we're really talking about what's going on in our lives and our hearts, and that's a huge topic, is communication. But if we're really staying in touch with each other, yes, there's hard work. Yes, we're not feeling as compatible. But if I all of a sudden one day just said, I feel completely incompatible with you, that would probably be the result of a slow drift that was happening over time. And once we're pretty far apart, I'm feeling this dramatic incompatibility. But to stick with covenant and compatibility, one of the premises that we speak about a lot is in a Christian marriage, what we're trying to do is learn, how does God love us? And then he's inviting us to love each other in similar ways to the way he loves us. And in the Bible, the way God expresses his love is by making and keeping covenantal promises. So he says to Abraham, I will be your God and you will be my people. And he says this to Israel in various places. I promise my love to you, and it is a faithful promise. So the way God loves is by making a covenantal promise and keeping it. So if we're really looking for a Christian view of marriage, we're looking for a covenant-based marriage. Now, compatibility will always be in the air. Like, how compatible are we? It's always going to be part of the conversation. But back to the two rails, covenant and compatibility will always be present in any married couple. If it's high on compatibility and low on covenant, that's people who effectively are doing a cultural view of marriage, and then they're going to come to a crisis on compatibility, and then they're going to be invited to learn what is covenant all about. A couple who come into it with a covenant view of marriage, their understanding is this vow and this promise we've made to each other is the thing that our marriage is based on. And so our compatibilities and the ups and downs of compatibility don't really mean the marriage is threatened, because we came in on the premise of covenantal promise. Now, when I say that, I know that there's tons of building blocks underneath all of that. And that's what we spent a full weekend talking about.
Yeah.
What does it mean to understand marriage from a covenantal basis? Because not many people do understand that, but we do believe that that's the biblical invitation, that this covenant is the thing. So over time, it's not the compatibility that is the glue, it's the covenant that's the glue.
So let me back up for a second, just because I think that in my mind, and perhaps in others, the word covenant outside of the Bible is a somewhat foreign word. And so it's a concept that's a little hard to get our hands around. When you
Yeah,
say our covenantal promise, is
yeah.
that any different in essence from like a real promise, a promise you intend on keeping, as opposed to, I promise you this is going to work out?
Right. Cross my heart and hope to die.
Yeah.
Yeah, the word covenant, thanks for calling attention to that. I mean, that's kind of one of these sometimes big, scary religious words, which I can fully appreciate. So the word covenant is, this is a promise that comes with every intention of my will and every expression of my character. Okay. And this word covenant, it starts with God. That's why it's important to know that, right? Because I could say to you, I promise to meet you at the restaurant on Thursday at noon. And you could say, well, yeah, it came with every expression of my will and every expression of my character. But isn't it a little deeper than that? Yes, it is deeper than that. God is the originator of covenants. So a covenant is a God-made promise. And God loves us by making these promises to us. I will love you and you will be my people, and I will always be faithful to you. right? This is repeated in the Bible. So God is the one who has brought the idea of covenant into human experience. We learn it from God. And we often say, well, you can stop me or redirect how you want. A covenant is very different than a contract. And this is another part of what we talk about a lot. A covenant-based marriage is different than a contract-based marriage. A contract has performance agreements, conditions, and penalties. A covenant has none of that.
And loopholes.
And loopholes.
Yeah.
Right? So a contract basically says, I will do this if you do this. And when you do this, then I will do this. So it's very conditional and it's bilateral. A covenant is unilateral. It's a one-way promise. And effectively, we have learned this from God. God made a promise to his people. I will love you and I will be faithful to you, and I will be your God and you will be my people. And if the strength of a contract is the size of its penalties, right? Now, probably a good attorney would say, well, the strength of a contract is how well it's worded. I get that and I appreciate that. But like, if I was going to buy your house and the penalty for me backing out of it or doing you wrong is 25 cents, that contract has it's got no value. It's got no teeth to it. The penalties are way too small. If the penalty is $25,000, if I back out and don't perform, that contract's got some weight to it. I'm going to think twice before I leave you in a lurch. So in a sense, the strength of a contract is the size of its penalties. A covenant is very different. The strength of a covenant is the character of the person making the covenant. So this starts with what we've learned from God. He makes a covenantal promise to us. How good or reliable is that promise? It's only as good or reliable as God's character. But God's character, we would say, is that he's morally perfect. He is perfect love. God is light. In him, there's no darkness at all. So how good is that promise? It's as good as the character of the one who makes it. So now when we come to a Christian marriage and we have two people exchanging a covenantal promise, the richness, the depth, the reliability of that covenant is connected to the character of each one of us who's making that promise. And of course, that raises another 100 questions. How do I know? How do I know that when I make this promise, you mean the same thing that I mean when I say these words? When I say these words of a marriage promise, do they mean as much to you as they do to me? Do they mean the same thing to you as they do to me? All of this is stuff that's in play. So if I'm a part of a couple's wedding, I'm trying to help them learn about and understand this stuff so that when they do get married on their wedding day, they're invited into the richness and the beauty and the meaning of what this covenantal promise means. Because each one of them is going to make a unilateral promise, right? It's not bilateral. We would say, isn't it bilateral? You have two people involved? No. Bilateral is a contract. I do this if you do this. Unilateral is I'm doing this, right? And when I talk to couples and I want to get down to brass tacks, I say, guys, the wedding vows, the words of them are beautiful, but the bottom line of what we're saying is, I promise to love you and you only until one of us dies. Like, hello, like, wow. I promise to love you and you only until one of us dies. There's no if clause in it. It doesn't say, I promise to love you and you only until one of us dies, if, and then fill in the blank. So it's a unilateral promise. I made that promise to Elizabeth. And then she's going to make that promise to me. And I promise to love you and you only until one of us dies.
Well, and in a sense, aren't you also it's implicit in, if I'm going to love you until you die, that it's implicit in it, but it's also saying, I'm going to love you completely, even if you don't love me.
That's what a covenant says.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
And
that's
this
that's a tough one. That's a tough one for anybody to bite off. But as you say, that is at the core of it.
this is why you would like to know the character of the person with whom you're going to be saying these things. But in many respects, Tommy, you just in one way describe the story of the Bible.
Mm,
God says to his people, I'm going to love you whether you love me back or not. I'm going to love you whether you're faithful to my love or not. Now, he does say, my love will be experienced by those of you who keep a relationship with me, right? But it's a unilateral covenantal promise. So I said to Elizabeth in 1987, I promise to love you and you only till one of us dies. Notice the you only part. In the Bible, the word faithfulness is attached to love many, many, many times. Love and faithfulness go together. So that's got its own, we could do a podcast on that. But the point is, a covenant-based marriage is two people, each is going to make a unilateral promise to the other. I promise to love you, which is not only a sentiment, it's a verb and it's an expression of the will. I promise to love you as an expression of the will, as an intentional action that is at the center of my life's direction, and to seek your well-being. I promise to love you. Okay, this is all the kind of stuff you grow into over the years. Like if somebody's listening to this and saying, David, this stuff you're talking about, did you know this the day you got married? By no means. This is stuff we've learned by trying to pay attention to it over the years. But also, here's what's often in play. We can think we're doing a covenant-based marriage, but learn later on, actually, I was doing a compatibility-based marriage. Meaning, when I say I will love you and you only until one of us dies, I'm not saying I will love you as long as you gratify me. I will love you as long as I still find you exciting, as long as you're still pretty or handsome. I will love you as long as, because really all of that is jaded language, meaning I will stay with you as long as you're gratifying me.
yeah.
And that's compatibility based. That's not covenant based. So all of a sudden, people might be listening to this thinking, that's a high bar you're talking about. And that's true.
Mhm.
But the day Elizabeth and I got married, we weren't at this level of the high bar. We've talked about and worked at and tried to understand and tried to grow. This requires so many apologies, so much humbling, so much of both of us trying to do the work to say, we want our oneness to be a lasting reality. So I've got more on the whole oneness idea we can talk about in a minute, but
Yeah. Well, it's so good because I think at the bottom line, we enter into marriage and people do this at different levels of maturity, whatever. And we say words that in essence, we can't know the full meaning of.
right.
And we hope by the grace of God that we can grow into the truth of the promises that we've made. And
That's really well said.
yeah, that's where a lot of these.
You can't know all the implications and the meaning. So, sometimes I've thought about this and I've thought, okay, let's say you have a couple and they're, I don't know, 23 years old. It's a young couple getting married. Here's what I know when I'm doing their wedding. They're doing everything they know to do. Let's call it a Christian wedding. And they've done good preparation. They're doing the very best they know to do, but they don't know the implications of what this promise being made today is going to mean.
Yeah.
They don't know what the future holds. They don't know what ups and downs they're going to experience. But what they do know is, in a sense, Well, that's exactly why we're making this covenantal promise, because that covenantal promise is going to be our stake in the ground that says no matter what the future does hold, this covenantal promise is going to hold the future. And that becomes really significant. So, in a sense, all you could hope for, but also what you would hope for with a young couple is, do you mean this as sincerely as you know how to mean it?
Mm-hmm.
And if they both say yes, then you've got the best ingredients you can have. But you can't be 50 when you're 23. You can't have the life experience of a 60-year-old and the perspective and the foundation when you're 23. You only have the 23-year-old. Now, sometimes it's a mature 23-year-old, and that's great. But really, you're embarking on the future. And what I say to couples about covenant, in the Bible, God tells his people to trust him for the future. And anytime people try to take the future in their own hands, like, I'm going to try to figure it out myself, you've got various biblical stories of people who do weird things trying to learn about the future, like Saul going to a witch and weird stuff happening. And God basically says, don't do that. Trust me with the future. Okay, well, we don't know what the future is going to hold. But you know what's fascinating to me? The one thing God invites us to do to impact the future is to make a covenantal promise. And if you put this in the context of a young couple getting married, the day you get married, you have impacted the future. What do you mean by that? Well, the day you and Wheezy got married, you don't know if you're going to live in Memphis or Atlanta or Charlotte or Richmond or LA. But here's what you do know about the future: you'll be together.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, you have pierced the future with the covenantal promise today. You don't know every circumstance. You don't know all that's going to happen. You don't know if you're going to have kids or not, how many, where you're going to live, what your jobs are going to be. But as of this day, here's something we know about the future: we will be together.
That's a wild thought. I've never thought about that impact of a marriage kind of piercing and diving right into the future. I think that's an amazing thought. So anyway, I love that. That's
And
great.
frankly, to add to that, Tommy, I love to say to couples, God is a creator and he's creative. And one of the things that's happening at your wedding is God is creating something new in the world today. And I say this a lot in homilies and weddings. I say, as of this day, there is something new in the world today. And that new is the two of you with a marriage covenant. And the implications of this are going to be substantial in the future. The world will be different because of what you're doing today. Now, most of us are like, no, not me. I'm not like some big famous person. It doesn't matter if you're not a big famous person. At various levels, even what we might call modest levels, this covenant, this promise is going to impact the world. And that's powerful and beautiful.
It is. I mean, if you just take the image of two becoming one,
Yeah.
something utterly organically different has happened. You now don't have two, you now have one. That is
Yep.
the two of you. And then the likelihood, the possibility, certainly, of children coming from that. There's probably very few things, kind of to your point, that pierce the future more than a wedding day.
Yep.
That's
Yeah.
great. I love that.
It's powerful. Yeah. I could go on that topic forever, but
So let's
your
shift,
podcast.
shift direction a little bit. So if we take this kind of covenantal promise, we do the very, very best we can to set that stake in the ground to say, okay, you know what? No matter what, I will stay faithful in my love for you till the day you die. So we've set that stake into the ground, and then we walk into a new reality, and that's we're human and we're trying to deal with things. So let's shift forward a little bit to the things that happen post wedding day. And, this is almost like one of those lightning rounds. You've seen a lot when it comes to marriages. And of course, you're 36 years. I'm at 42 years of it. And so we've seen a lot. What in your experience would you say, going to hit two sides of this, are two or three of the most important ingredients of a really good, healthy, vibrant, loving marriage? And then on the other side of it, what are two or three things that you've seen that are the most destructive things that can happen in a marriage or that are present in a marriage?
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to say the most important thing for a healthy marriage is a vision, a proper vision of what this is all about. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? What's at stake? If the two of you have a proper vision of what we're doing and why, that's going to be one of the biggest contributors. So I hope it doesn't sound like shameless plugs, but we do this marriage weekend twice a year at Hope Church called the Book on Love. If anybody wanted to be a part of it down the road, they're certainly welcome to do that, whether they're Hope people or not. But most of what the Book on Love is about is a vision of marriage. If we can help couples have a God-given biblical vision, I think that's probably the most important part of it. What we're mostly saying is what we're doing when we get married is we're doing love, trying to do it in the way that we've learned that God loves us. And then we get into all kinds of layers of what does that mean? So I'll give you an example. And a lot of this is stuff I've learned over the years. But many years ago, a minister mentor to me asked me once I started doing some weddings, he said, David, are you doing like pre-marriage preparation with couples? And I said, yeah. And he said, are you teaching them why they're getting married? And I said, yeah, I'm teaching them, biblical text, blah, blah, blah. And then he said, but are you teaching them why they're getting married? And I said, well, yeah, I think so. I think you just asked me that. And I talked a little more. And then he got up on the edge of his seat and he got really animated. He said, no, David, are you teaching them why they're getting married? And at that point, I'm like, okay, you've got something in mind here that I'm not thinking about. What are you on to? Like, what do you want me to say? He said, are you teaching them that they're getting married to display the glory of God? And I said, tell me more about that. He said, marriage is God's design. He's given it to us to love another person according to his way of loving us. And the idea would be that when people see the way we love each other, they would have a greater understanding of how God loves us. Like no words are needed. The idea being people could simply observe your marriage relationship, and by watching the way you love each other, they would have a better picture of how God loves us, right? So this is what he means when he says, are you teaching them they're getting married to display the glory of God? Of course, my joke is like, I am now. I mean, like now that you've given it to me like that, there's more to it, of course. We're getting married because we're crazy in love with each other, definitely. And we want to experience all the friendship, the joy, the intimacy. Yes, of course, all of that. But that stuff all over time, that stuff lives on compatibility. And if that was your driver, you're going to hit a really big crisis. All marriages will have compatibility and covenant, but if covenant is the driver, then we begin to realize, wow, we're making a marriage covenant because we learned this from God. This is what God does with his people. He's inviting us to do likewise. When God invites a man and a woman, and I'm going to try to draw a triangle here. When God invites a man and a woman to make a marriage covenant with God at the center, so let's say he's at the apex of the triangle. If each one of us is growing closer to God, then by definition, we have to be growing closer to each other. And also, A man and a woman with God at the center is three of us. And what we've got here now is a little picture of a Trinity. And so God has always existed in perfect love among the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So when he invites us into marriage, one thing that he's made in the world today on our wedding day is a new little picture of the Trinity. The two of us with God at the center, learning the love that moves among the Trinity. So when Jack said to me, are you teaching them they're getting married to display the glory of God? I mean, I'm like, this podcast is trying to shrink a full weekend marriage seminar into a little bit of time. But so what I would say there is that a really solid vision of what this is all about is perhaps the most important ingredient for a vibrant marriage that I know of.
Yeah, I love that. And I've been to the book on love, and I think one of the surprising best elements of book on love is the simplicity and clarity of it, because there's so many things, that you can teach about related to marriage. But when you come out of the book on love, you come out with a clear sense of what really matters. And that, okay, if I get this right, I'm well on the way towards many other things and towards a path, a vision, as you say, of how to proceed forward on many other things. And it's all around that idea of oneness and the covenant, the unilateral kind of commitment to the well-being of the other person. And, that unilateral commitment to the well-being of another person, if you take that at face value, that is a daunting, daunting thing. And it's a beautiful thing.
Yes. Well, so we talk a lot about in Genesis 1, we have these pictures of God making human beings. And in Genesis 1, 26 and 27, the word image of God appears 3 times in these 2 verses. We learned in seminary when something appears 3 times in a short little section, it's really important. So 3 times God says, let us make mankind in our image. So one of the things that we talk about a lot in our marriage teaching is whether we knew it or not, a lot of us go into marriage and we begin to realize I was actually in this for how you were going to make me happy.
Mm-hmm.
Said another way, I'm trying to make you in my image, meaning I'm trying to make you to be the person I want you to be to make me happy. Okay. Honestly, it's pretty normal. It happens most of the time. It happens to most couples. It happened to Elizabeth and me until we got to the point where we had to learn this is not the right way to look at what we're doing here. So we make little jokes like, let's say Elizabeth doesn't like the kind of shirts I wear. So it's my birthday and she buys me a present and I open the box and it's a shirt. And I look at it and I don't love it. Well, what is it? Well, it's actually the kind of shirt she wishes I would wear, but she gave it to me on my birthday. So it's actually a present to her, which is me in the kind of shirt she wishes I would wear on the occasion of my birthday. So it's a pretty sneaky little agenda going on, which is she got herself a present and gave it to me on the occasion of my birthday. And the present she got herself is the kind of shirt she wishes I would wear. Okay. This is we use it as a funny little example where we're trying to steer each other to get each other to be more the kind of person I wish you would be for me. Well, if we do that in that quiet, subversive way over a period of years, which frequently happens in marriages, X number of years down the road, we're going to get to the point where we're like, this marriage isn't working. I'm frustrated. I'm exhausted. I'm worn out. I'm not happy. And it's because we've both spent 6 years trying to get the other person to be what I want you to be for me, as compared to I'm trying to give myself to help you become the best person that God created you to be in his image, not in my image.
Yeah. The first is manipulation.
Completely. And most marriages do this, and we learn to be very good at it in a subtle, quiet way until there's a straw that breaks the camel's back X number of years in, and somebody flies off the handle and, like use the example of the gift, and I open it, and it's just the straw that breaks the camel's back. And I say something like, I am so sick and tired of this. And the other one says, so sick and tired of what? I'm so sick and tired of feeling like you're trying to steer me, fix me, manage me, make me, control me. And this becomes a crisis. And again, at the risk of overstating this, that was a compatibility-based marriage, meaning I'm trying to make you compatible for me. And a lot of times this is what couples would call a 7-year itch. Like 7 years in, we hit this big crisis. What's the big crisis? It's that one I just told you about. I'm so tired of this. I'm so worn out. I'm so exhausted. I'm so unhappy. Well, what are we going to do? Well, we've hit a crossroads here. And I'll draw a diagram of two roads. I'm not a great artist, but I'll try to draw like two streets. And the streets are Compatibility Road and Covenant Road. And we've now come to the crossroads of compatibility and covenant. And what I say is there's a cross at the crossroads. And what's happening is up to this point, we've been doing compatibility-based marriage. And I've been trying to manipulate you to get you to be more compatible for what I want. Now we're coming to the crossroads, and our decision is, am I going to stop trying to make you to be what I want you to be for me? Am I going to start loving you for who you truly are? Am I going to lay myself down and stop trying to get what I want? That's the cross at the crossroads. Am I going to die to myself and actually start loving you? Because really, up to that point, what I've been doing is using you to gratify me. It's painful to say it, but sometimes you just got to say the truth of it to really expose it. So now, in many respects, Tommy, many of us hit the crossroads, and it may be the invitation to love another person for real for the first time in our lives.
Yeah, and the thing that I would want to throw in here is that when we kind of talk about this compatibility and these manipulation games, I say this just out of my own reality. We're not talking about, well, this is what people do who go into marriage with the wrong idea and, don't have their acts together and aren't really very spiritual people. This is what all of us deal with.
That's what I mean.
All come to grips with our own self-centeredness and selfishness, and the people that on the outside others would look and say, well, that's about as perfect a spouse as you could ever imagine.
Yes.
Marriage uncovers and exposes all of that junk. And so that you and I both have had exposed to us those ugly little manipulative things that we have done. And people go, well, oh, not you, not David Dwight. No, this is our stuff. It's all of our stuff.
100%. I would just be reiterating what you're saying. It's normal is the best way I know how to say it. It's normal. But what happens is normal leads us to this crisis at the crossroads. And there is a cross at the crossroads, and we'll have to decide what we're going to do there. Now, said gracefully, we know life can get very hard and difficult. Some people will get divorced at the crossroads. Something has to die at the crossroads. I'm going to say this in a very stark way. Something has to die at the crossroads. Either I will die to my manipulations of trying to get you to be what I want you to be for me. And if I die to self, then we have an opportunity to really grow into the marriage and maybe for the first time begin to actually love each other for what it means to love another human being. Or, this is going to sound hard to say, but I will not die, so the marriage will die. and we'll get divorced. Again, I want to say with lots of grace and understanding, a lot of hard things happen in life, and we understand that. But sometimes seeing these things with some illumination can be helpful. So what I would say is a healthy vision of marriage is probably the best thing you can have. I'll add a couple more. You said three, and these will be much quicker. One is, if we can do it, we're going to come into marriage with an other-centeredness rather than a self-centeredness. Almost nobody really does that at the beginning, but I'm doing what I can do to try to help young couples understand this at the beginning. Another big one, if you had it, but in today's world, it's less and less. If your parents had a healthy marriage, they gave you an incredible gift, which is simply a model that you observed over decades. And most of us, without intentionality, what most of us will do in marriage is we'll do what we saw our parents do. We'll basically do it the way we saw our parents do it until somebody helps us give some really critical engagement to that. So if your parents did it well, then you're going to just do what your parents did, and you'll be really fortunate because you'll have a good model and you'll do it relatively well.
Yeah.
If your parents did it poorly, here's one of the challenges of life. Most of us, unless our upbringing was way outside the bounds of normal dysfunction, right? I always say all families are dysfunctional because we're all dysfunctional. What you're hoping for is dysfunction within the normal range. Okay. A really unhealthy or abusive situation, that's outside the normal range. But we're hoping that it was inside the normal range. But basically, most all of us grow up thinking whatever I grew up with is normal. That's the way it is, right? That's the way families work. That's the way families function. That's the way communication happens. That's the way relationships happen. Whatever we did in our family was so normative for us that we're pretty sure that's just the way normal is, until we begin to see and learn a lot. But the point is, you're probably going to think if your parents' marriage, even if it wasn't that healthy, it's in the normal range, but it's still dysfunctional, you're going to think that's what a healthy marriage is. So you're going to repeat the unhealthy things as well. So you would like to try to learn. There is no marriage that's perfect. But I usually say to young couples, let's talk about three things your parents did well that you would want to bring into your marriage. And let's, with all respect for your parents, consider three things maybe weren't so healthy, and let's try to not reproduce those in our marriage. And believe me, every time I do that, like our daughter is married, I envision her sitting with a counselor saying, let's talk about three things your parents did well and bring them into your marriage. And let's talk about three things they didn't do well, and let's not reproduce those. But that's all stuff that I'm trying to help young couples have a chance to engage.
Yeah, that's great. So we try to go into it with, that other centeredness, and we try to go into it with this right vision. And then beyond our own inability to truly be other centered and to care this way, we're then hit and slammed with the outside things that hit us in marriage. So I think about this in a sense as kind of the unique things that happen in different seasons of life. So we have this season of some length of time, let's say, of it's just the husband and wife. And then for many, at least, there's a season of small children. And that has this slew of challenges to it. And then those little children grow into bigger children, a whole nother challenge.
Yeah.
And then we're all of a sudden thrown back to almost this no children scenario and all of that. So I'm just curious, kind of in real broad swaths, what do you see in terms of the challenges, kind of the unique challenges that are thrown on top of our own struggles to be other-centered that come along with these seasons?
Yeah. So a quick thought. It's really interesting when you read in Genesis, when God creates Adam and Eve, and I won't go into the whole story, but it says he brought the woman to the man. And then it says, for this reason, the man shall leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they're invited to this oneness. And we say throughout the marriage weekend, what's the goal of marriage? Oneness. Oneness is always the goal. We repeat this over and over again. But interestingly, it's like it's a head scratcher, like a fun head scratcher with the Bible. The only people there are Adam and Eve. And it says, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. Well, there is no father and mother yet. Adam and Eve are the only two people there are. There's no fathers and mothers yet. Now, when Adam and Eve have kids, then they'll be fathers and mothers. And then when they have generations, you'll have in-laws and the whole thing. But the point is, joining Adam and Eve in that marriage covenant, this is the first relationship. Okay. So when you get married, it's the two of you, most of the time, no kids. This is your first relationship. This is your new first family. We talk about this a lot. Okay, now here's a little thing like to encourage couples. Let's say you have kids. Let's say you have kids and there's a little bit of an age range of the kids. But let's say it's 25 years that you're going to have kids in your home. Maybe a little less, I don't know, but people will get the point. Okay, so let's say you're going to be married. Let's say most people are hoping we're going to be able to do the whole thing. Let's just take a number and say we're hoping we're going to be married 70 years. Okay, that means 45 out of your 70, there'll be no kids in the picture. The vast majority of your years are the two of you with no kids right in the middle of it. So you got married. Most of the time, there's no kids yet. Then you have kids. You do a run for 20 some years, and then the kids are gone. What many couples do is they forget that the marriage relationship is the centerpiece and the first relationship of the family, and that the health of the marriage is the health of the family. So we're constantly encouraging couples to cultivate a marriage-centered family rather than a children-centered family. Now, this is so countercultural in our culture. Like some people are going to hear that and say, what did he say? Cultivate a marriage-centered family rather than a children-centered family. Yeah. First of all, a lot of people are going to say, what does that even mean? Like, how do you even do that? Well, our culture has said, basically, you sacrifice the marriage relationship to make sure that you run your kids around to every ball game and piano lesson on the planet. The fact of the matter is, what your kids and mine need to know more than anything else to be healthy, well-adjusted adults, what our kids need to know more than anything else is that their parents are in a loving and secure marriage. They need that more than the baseball coach and the ballet teacher and the travel ball, and they need that more than anything. So if my marriage is at risk because I sacrifice the marriage on the altar of the kids and every opportunity, then I'm pursuing a mistaken vision. Now, I realize when I say this, because when we teach this, people are like lined up to say, how in the world do you do that? Maybe that's for another day, but that's my precursor to the different seasons of life.
Yeah.
So you're married as a couple, you have no kids. This is learning how to love each other. It's growing your life together. It's seeking to understand each other. It's growing to begin to learn how to communicate with each other. Then you have kids. Once you start having kids, you will realize that before you had kids, you used the word tired, like I'm really tired. And now you know that you had no idea what tired meant. When you used it before you had kids and after you have kids, you realize I can't even believe I used that word before I had kids.
That's so true. Yeah.
So you're in the season with little kids, and man, you're so tired. What we would encourage you to do is, yeah, it's exhausting. Make time frequently for the two of you as a married couple to make sure you're talking, connecting, communicating. right? And that doesn't have to be a fancy dinner date out. That can be put the kids to bed, no screens, no phones, no TVs, no iPads. It is just us talking. That's what it means to cultivate a marriage-centered family. And we're not going to spend the whole time talking about our kids.
Yeah.
We're going to talk together about our hearts. So, in very general terms, that's what I would say when the kids are little.
Yeah, I remember when you and I, actually, the four of us, Weezy and I, and you and Elizabeth, were in a parenting class back 35 years ago, a long time. And we were going through it. And one of the big pushes of this, it was the most memorable, and the thing that I, really walked away with was this idea of having couch time with
Yeah,
your
yeah,
spouse.
yeah,
And
yeah.
we were supposed to, when you came home from work or whatever, the two of you were supposed to sit down for 15 minutes, and the kids weren't allowed to interrupt. And you were supposed to have 15 minutes where you were displaying, in essence, in every way, the reality that this is a marriage-centered relationship rather than a child-centered relationship. And we
Right.
laughed like crazy about how incredibly impossible it was to execute couch time.
Well, you'll notice in my example, I said the couch time is after you put the kids to bed. Yes, because I remember that.
Gosh, yeah, that was tough.
Yeah. But that's an example of trying to cultivate a marriage-centered family. But what's going to happen is every couple is going to have to find their way of doing that.
Right.
Then you have, small children. So we talk about that. Then you get into teenage years. Well, with small children, the old adage, people say this a lot, and I think it's true. The days are long, but the years are short. I mean, there are days when your kids are little and you are just so exhausted, you can't even believe it. And so the days are so long, but it is true. Those years go quick, and your kids are no longer little cute toddlers, and now they're outgrowing innocence and a lot of other things that happen. So then we've got teenagers, and that's complexity at a new level. How does our relationship with our children adjust now that they're teenagers? And talking about that and communicating is going to be a really big piece of that. People say when your kids are little, your fatigue is physical exhaustion. And when your kids are teenagers, your fatigue is more emotional exhaustion. When our kids were little, I had a mentor friend who said to me, everybody talks about beware the teenage years, oh, fear the teenage years. He said to me, don't buy that for a minute. He said, teenage years are great. Your kids are starting to become who they really are. They're really growing into their personality. You get to be alongside with them as they're learning and figuring this out. Your conversations are more meaningful and substantial. And he was like, my wife and I were like, we love the teenage years. And so we would encourage you, don't enter the teenage years with this, like, oh no, it's going to be so hard, fear the teenage years. And that was really, really helpful to us. So that would be my advice with the teenage years. And then, you get into your kids departing. Maybe it's jobs, maybe it's college, maybe it's marriages, and it's us again. So we're empty nesters, where empty nesting is the biggest crisis. And I want to say this gently because it's so understandable how this happens. But it's when we completely forfeited our marriage relationship for the kids, and
Right.
everything in our life was devoted to jobs and kids, jobs and kids, jobs and kids. And then when the kids are gone, we're like, we don't know what to do. We feel like we don't even know each other. We don't even know how to do life together. So I read an article recently that said there's a rise in the counseling world of counselors who are empty nest coaches, helping couples learn how to do this because they need someone to help them learn how to do it. It's very understandable, and I say that with a real sympathetic heart. But you can see why this has happened, because without knowing better, we really did neglect our marriage to chase our kids all over the place and pursue the jobs.
Sure.
Now, If you have two parents that are working, that's got its own dynamic. If you've got one parent working for pay and the other one is an at-home parent, like raising kids, these dynamics all will ask for their own nuances. But the biggest highway, Tommy, behind this is communication. Are we learning how to communicate well with each other? Are we becoming good communicators? Are we good at communicating? And what we've learned over the years is to try to learn how to become really good listeners. And listening is an art. And, this is a whole nother big, huge topic. But one of the things we emphasize the most when we're trying to encourage couples is how do we learn to become the very best communicators with each other that we can? And that's going to start with how do we become the best listeners that we can? And a phrase that we really like is the best communicators seek to understand rather than be understood. So all of this stuff is.
Well, and I would throw in another element. It's not self-promoting, but it's kind of my strong passion is that underneath the communication and underneath the listening is the commitment to creating space in the marriage to begin with. That often you have people that have a great desire to communicate well and they want to listen well, but they are rushing about so fast and so furiously and are so completely exhausted and overwhelmed and stressed out that there's no internal ability to listen, even though they might be the quality of a person that would be so great at it. So to me, one of the core things, and I think we'll have a whole podcast episode in this marriage series on this, is, what can we do foundationally to create kind of an infrastructure of space that allows the seed of listening to actually happen?
So true. It's so true. Communication and listening, there are many good books on this. I would encourage people if they want, there are a lot of good books on this. But one of them, picking up on what you're saying, is focused attention. The only way you're going to really connect is when you are both present with focused attention. So anything that is keeping you from focused attention, you want to eliminate it from our effort to communicate right here. So like what could keep me from focused attention? Distractions, too much stuff going on in my mind, me thinking about other things while I'm in this conversation with you. Screens, of course, 1,000,000%. To have a really good conversation. Elizabeth and I say this, and this is also one of the really countercultural things we say. We say no screens when you're trying to communicate. And we also say, ready, this is how to stir the pot. No screens in the bedroom. And that's got a lot of other stuff behind why we would say that. But you can't really connect in communication if somebody's got a phone in their hand or they're glancing at it on a nearby table. You can't really have a good connection if there's a TV flickering in the background or on in the room. All of that has to get turned off for focused attention. And that's really, really important for marriages to grow over the years, is that kind of focused attention and communication.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think of our breakfasts that we've had over the 35 years, and not all of those have phones even been in the equation. But somewhere along the line, we never needed to discuss the issue of our phones interrupting the times and the conversations that we had. And so we have always had the privilege, the benefit of focused attention when we get together, and that's what we should be offering one another. And it's a high standard. And I think, as you're saying, with all of these things, we're saying these things with the reality and the knowledge that we're all so flawed and imperfect, and we don't mean in any ways to be judging. We're hopefully trying to inspire and aspire one another to
It's
better things.
it's totally true. A quick thought, and then sort of picking up on what you're talking about. Think about marriages 100 years ago. There was no email, there were no phones, there were no TVs. I mean, you didn't have all these distractions to take your attention away from each other. Now, there's always distractions, but there were a lot less of them. With regard, Tommy, to, setting a high bar and all that, I want to kind of reiterate what I want to make clear from the beginning of the podcast. Pretty much everything I've shared in this conversation is stuff that I've learned through the challenges and the character growth opportunities in my own marriage. I'm not telling victory stories. I'm telling stories which are, in essence, learning from the endeavor of marriage, learning when I've had to face my own shortcomings and character flaws. And, sometimes what couples will say, which I understand, but, young couples, a lot of them will say, you know what, we're going to get marriage right. We're going to do it right. We're going to have the right kind of marriage. Well, there's a certain part of that which you want to encourage, which is definitely you want to have that kind of vision and ambition to have a really great marriage. But to keep things in balance, what I would say is there are no perfect marriages because there are no perfect people. Sometimes younger couples that come from divorced parents have that sentiment even stronger, like we're not going to make the mistakes our parents made. We're not going to do this. We're going to have a really good marriage. Okay, again, I appreciate for sure the endeavor to say we want to do this well. But we human beings are very flawed. So we may not make the mistakes our parents made, but we'll be plenty good enough at making our own unique brand of our own mistakes. So what I like to say to couples is, I love the sentiment, we want to do this right. And that's awesome. But maybe a little bit less, we're going to have the perfect marriage, like we're going to do it just right. A little bit less of that and a little bit more of the energy, which is, what we're going to do? We're going to enter this by being willing to do the hard work to help our marriage thrive. So not so much we're going to get it right, more we're willing to do the hard work to seek to help our marriage thrive.
Yeah, which counterintuitively, it kind of requires a certain humility to it to say, you know what, we're going to do this right, but it's going to be by the grace of God, because
Totally.
I've got so much that's pulling it in the other direction, not to mention all of the cultural forces. So by the grace of God, we'll survive.
It's funny. I don't know if this is true of everybody, but I don't know. Probably a lot of us, if we're young and we're getting married in our 20s or 30s, we feel like we're a pretty good catch. Like, like, hey, this person should be happy. Like they got a pretty good catch. They got me. And then over the years, marriage will be like, hold a mirror up in front of you. And you're like, I'm not as good a catch as I thought. We do this thing where, like bathroom mirrors, like a little handheld mirror. Most everybody's got one of these. It's either in a drawer or it's mounted on the wall of their bathroom. And one side is normal magnification and the other side is a much, much higher magnification. And it's like an illustration for marriage. When we were dating and we were engaged, we had the normal magnification. We saw each other sort of from a certain distance. But once you grow into married life and you're doing domestic life together and, you're getting the laundry done and trying to find where the toothpaste cap is, it's like the mirror flips and you're getting that really high magnification. And this is a little gross, but I'll say it. I always say, those blackheads and those zits that you couldn't see from a distance, now with the high magnification, you can see them.
Yeah.
It's like those shortcomings that we didn't see when we didn't know each other that well. Those are earlier on in the marriage, but as we get years into the marriage, we're going to start seeing this really close up stuff. So what are we going to do? Now, sometimes what happens is somebody in a marriage will say to me, I mean, they won't say it this way, but for playing with a little bit, what'll happen is somebody will say, you know what? I'm realizing that my spouse isn't quite as exciting and impressive as I thought they were. And I want to say, and what were you thinking they were thinking about you? Right? Like, as though I'm thinking, she's not as exciting and impressive as I thought. Oh, and are you thinking she's thinking you are as exciting and impressive as she thought?
Exactly.
We have a funny way of skewing our way of seeing these things.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there are so many different things, that we could get into. I want to kind of move a little bit to wrapping up, and maybe just an interesting take. I'm really kind of curious of what your responses are on this, but I think of, what we really haven't highlighted too much within this. We've talked about two people getting married, but is talking about a man and a woman getting married. And there are differences that are implicit in this. And I'd be curious, out of all of your experiences of both counseling, helping people, things that you've noticed, could you pick out one thing in particular that behind closed doors you would want to say to a group of men about the marriage relationship, about how to make the marriage relationship thrive, about what men need to hear? And then we'll reverse it and say, and this is dangerous for you as a man to do, but is there something that you would say to women?
So wait, that's going to be two men talking about what women need to hear.
Exactly.
That's great.
That's fine.
I'm imagining some women like driving in their car, listening to this podcast, slapping their car dashboard when they hear something. All right, what would I say? What do men need to hear? Um, Here's what I would say for men: learn to understand and grow into what intimacy is, completely apart from the topic of sex. That's what I would say to men. And again, because the timing of this podcast is coming right off the heels of 2 weekends of the conference,
And we're recording this the day before Valentine's Day,
which is a whole nother topic, of course. But we say intimacy is vulnerability with sincerity. And so men learn how to do that. For most men, that's a journey, because vulnerability brings certain emotional aspects that a lot of men are uncomfortable with or they're not used to. And a lot of times, if we're in a conversation that's taking us to places emotionally we're not comfortable with, what we'll tend to do is say something sarcastic or dismissive. It's a coping mechanism because this conversation's getting too vulnerable. It's making me feel emotionally anxious. And as a generalization, I know there are always exceptions to generalizations. I think this is particularly a growth area for men. If we could learn to communicate with our wives in intimate ways, that is, with vulnerability and sincerity, there's so much beauty that comes from that.
I love that. And I have to admit, I think that's a real struggle point for me. And at the core, I think part of that struggle is my mental obstacle of thinking that is or mutually exclusive with my call to be a strong male. And I think that, one of the things that I believe, even to the degree I haven't experienced it, is that it takes the ultimate strong male to be able to do that.
Years ago, all right, how crazy is this? I actually remember this, and I think it's probably because it really struck me many years ago. A lot of people won't even know who these people are. An actress named Jane Fonda, and she was married to Ted Turner. And Ted Turner was a huge multimillionaire business magnate, and their I think they did get divorced, but I have no idea where I read this. It must have been a long flight on an airplane, and I was going stir crazy, and I picked out the airline magazine or something. I don't know. But it was an interview with Jane Fonda. And this is crazy. I'm talking about this. I bet this was 20 years ago when I read this. Here's what I remember about this. The person asks her a little bit about, Ted, and, you've been divorced now for about a year and so on. And what's your relationship like now? And Jane Fonda said, I'll tell you one thing that I really, really admire about Ted Turner. He was strong enough to admit and talk about his insecurities. And just think about that phrase. I remember thinking, okay, this is a woman saying this, and her description of this man's strength was he was strong enough to talk about his insecurities, right? So that flips the script, because you and I are sort of taught, well, if you're strong, you don't talk about that kind of stuff. If you take what Jane Fonda was saying, and I think I remember reading it and wondering, having a little light bulb go on, I wonder if this is the way most women think of strength in men. He's strong enough to talk about his insecurities and fears, right? Now, there's a big difference between an appropriate way to talk about your insecurities and fears and basically being a whiner. I don't think a lot of women want to be married to a whiner. But if you take Jane Fonda's word and she says he was strong enough to talk about his insecurities and fears, you could presume a flip of that and say, you know what? He's not strong enough to talk about his insecurities and fears. Or say it another way, he's too weak to talk about his insecurities and fears. So I just remember reading that article. It's funny how you remember these little things sometimes, and it really registered with me. This is a woman saying one of the things she most admired about this man was he was strong enough to talk about his insecurities and fears. So we talk a lot in this content, and we basically say your sexual intimacy, your sex life, and your sexual intimacy, it's just an indicator of the intimacy that you have in general in your relationship. So we say basically your sex life is a thermometer of the overall quality of your relationship and your emotional engagement and intimacy. A thermometer versus a thermostat. A thermometer tells you the temperature, where a thermostat sets the temperature. A lot of secular or Hollywood versions of marriage would tell you that sex is the thermostat, that it sets the temperature. Over the long arc of marriage, I think most experienced people would say, no, it's the thermometer. The emotional intimacy and connection of our marriage in its day-to-day is what will enable a rich, exciting, beautiful sexual intimacy. So what I would say to men is, like with most men, if you say, hey, guys, we're going to talk about intimacy, they're immediately thinking that means we're going to talk about sex.
Right.
But if you say, no, and guess what? We're not going to be talking about sex. A lot of guys would be like, what? Like, what does intimacy even mean if you're not talking about sex? It's what we're talking about here. Intimacy is vulnerability with sincerity. And if men can learn to do that, I've had my own growth journey in this area, and it's been a big one, believe me. I think this is one of the biggest things men need to hear. I don't love the word need to hear. Maybe men could benefit from hearing.
Right. Great. Okay. So now with fear and trepidation, what would women benefit from hearing?
Well, Tommy, I only had one thing that men need to hear, but I have 12 things that women need to hear.
Okay. Boy, we're going to get
Okay, ladies,
on this
listen up.
podcast.
Okay, ladies, listen up. It's interesting to me that as both of these thoughts come to mind, they're both in and around emotional terrain, but in a different way. What I would say to ladies is don't ask your husband to be God for you in terms of meeting your emotional and internal needs in ways that only God can do it. Another human being cannot meet our emotional needs in the ways that only God can do it. And so, what I would say to women is hopefully your husband loves you and he's a great guy with the very best of intentions, and he's growing in terms of emotional engagement, but he's not going to be able to meet all your emotional needs probably in the way you wish that he would. That's not a surprise. He's a human being. And so, back to what we talked about a while ago, like with the idea of God creating the man and the woman with God at the center, the more each of us is focused on growing in a deep relationship with God and understanding God's love for us and how he has loved us and what he's done for us in Christ, how he's forgiven us with a sacrifice at the middle of it, the more we're growing into that as individuals, the more we will be, one, getting our deepest needs met by God, and two, growing in our ability to love another person. So I also don't want the pendulum to swing so far that a woman would hear this and say, so are you telling me that marriage has nothing to do with emotion or my emotional needs in any way, shape, or form? No, I'm not saying that. We understand, of course, that emotional heart connections are a really big part of marriage. But your husband won't be able to meet your emotional needs in ways that only God can.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So seeking to grow in that understanding and seeking to grow close to the Lord in that, I think might be helpful.
Well, and subject we haven't even touched on, we won't have time to touch on, but it's at least worth mentioning is that we don't enter into or experience marriage we shouldn't in isolation. It's not the only relationship out there. And I know we know and have experienced this, the importance for men to have other men that they can talk to and that they can, experience honesty and transparency with. And the same thing for women to have that. And even for couples to have other couples that they can enter into, that any marriage that is meaningfully isolated is at a particular risk. And for a lot of the reasons that we've said. So,
And can I add to that? If you are, I agree with everything you just said. Like a healthy human being has a certain circle of trustworthy friends. And we know that in today's world, that's a whole nother topic, loneliness and isolation and the whole bit. But what I want to say is, yes, there are certain ways that we have aspects of our emotions and our psychological well-being met by people that are not solely our spouse. If you're going to talk about your marriage or your spouse with somebody else, it's really important that that is done with sincerity, that it's not a gripe fest.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
That it's not throwing your spouse under the bus. Your marriage won't improve if it's in a hard place and what you do is have a gripe fest with other people about your spouse. It can improve if you are talking to somebody else to ask them to help you and the conversation is sincere and it's respectful and honoring of your spouse. That can be a wonderful thing.
Yep.
But there's a natural default sometimes that when we're hurting and then we talk to somebody else about our spouse, that we just make it a gripe fest, and that's not helpful.
Yeah.
Can I throw in two closing thoughts? Is that
Sure.
okay?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So there's sort of like little vision for closing it out. One of them is we talked about how God loves us by making covenants. And so when he's invited us to have a wedding and enter into a marriage covenant, one of the things that I like to say to couples is on your wedding day, when you stand face to face with each other and you make this covenantal promise to the other, this is the most like God thing you will ever do in your life. And that's really moving to me personally to think about that. This is the most like God thing you will ever do in your life. And again, understanding that life has various hardships and complexities, it's our hope that this is the one time you'll ever do this in your life. that this promise you're going to make to this person, that this is the only person on planet Earth to whom you will ever make this promise. And when we begin to grasp some of that, the sacredness and the holiness of marriage begins to be more understandable to us, right?
Mm.
Most traditional wedding services call it holy marriage, holy matrimony. Why? Because we're entering into a marriage covenant, and a marriage covenant is a holy thing. Why? Because the holy God loves his people by doing this, and he's inviting us to do likewise. So when you exchange a marriage vow, this is the most like God thing you'll ever do in your life. The other thing that we like to say for couples, particularly young couples, let's say you got married on a Saturday and it's the following Sunday and it's like 24 hours later, and you flew to Hawaii and you're having a honeymoon trip and it's wonderful and beautiful. And you get to your hotel, you put your bags in, it's late afternoon, and you decide to put on a pair of shorts and go down for a walk on the beach. And it's just a beautiful, warm, late afternoon, sun starting to get low in the sky. And you're bare feet and you're walking in like ankle deep water and you're holding hands and you're just thinking it just can't be any better. I mean, I'm just so happy. And you're holding the hand of this person to whom you've been married for 24 hours, and you're walking along the beach and, sun's getting low and first stars are beginning to peek out, sky's getting purple and beautiful. And then coming in the other direction, walking down the beach, moving a little bit more slowly, is a couple that looks a little older. And you notice that they're holding hands and they too are walking in ankle deep water. And what you don't know is that they too just arrived in Hawaii and they came for a 50th anniversary trip. And that couple walking in the other direction has experienced 50 years of marriage together. And they have gone through lots and lots of ups and downs. And we could just pick things that could be common to people: financial hardship and difficulty, burying all four of their parents, perhaps the loss of a child, the painful ups and downs of working at their married life through the difficulties of grief and stress and pressure. And they've done the work and they've held on to each other. And they have all these years together and they too are walking down the beach and they're holding hands. And you're the young couple and you're thinking, this is so incredible. And you're holding hands and it feels so good to be holding this hand I'm holding. Well, believe me, compared to that couple and the hand that they're holding, after 50 years of all that they've experienced together and the hard work that they've done and the life and the living that they've done together, the hand you're holding for that young couple, as meaningful and wonderful as it feels, is not even a fraction of the meaning and the wonderfulness of the hand that that older couple is holding. And the beauty and the value and the gift of marriage is just extraordinary. And so Elizabeth and I use this phrase when we wrap up the marriage conference, which is, we know this is hard work. It's okay if it is. Don't worry like it means we're doomed. You're not. Marriage is hard work. But the phrase we love to encourage couples with is, don't quit before the blessing. Because when you do that hard work, what's on the other side of the hard work is even more beautiful than it could have ever been. And I don't know exactly how to explain all this, but somehow God seems to express his beauty on the other side of hardship in ways that we couldn't ever see before we got to the hardship. And so that picture of these two young couples walking along the beach in Hawaii, one's been married for 24 hours and one's been married 50 years. It's a beautiful picture to us of the gift of marriage and a vision to stay the course of it.
Thank you. That is an incredibly powerful, beautiful, just vivid picture of what this is all about and why this is so worth our best efforts, our best conversation, our best thinking. So thanks so much for sharing that. I got to leave us with that. That's great. Thank you, David.
But I have a few more things that women need to hear.
like I said, I will
You
have
want
to
me to save those?
I think we'll stop there while we're still have our heads.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Yeah, thanks. This has been great. Look forward to more conversations. Your fourth time sometime soon.
Take care. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.